I would be sitting there mixing, and I'd just start watching that camera on Michael and listening, and I'd completely forget what I was there to do, just completely memorized by this guy that was dancing like a maniac and giving near perfect vocals.
This is Bill Schnee, considered by many to be one of the greatest producers and engineers of all time. Donald Fagen from Steely Dan said he was the best live engineer they ever worked with.
He was definitely the best live recording engineer we ran into.
Those of you familiar with Bill will know not only does he have a wealth of wisdom and knowledge, but he's also a fantastic storyteller. Although he's best known for his work in the studio, he's also worked on some of the greatest live recordings of all time.
So it's interesting because I haven't been asked that much about live recording. And whereas it's not a huge part of my life, I've been fortunate to do about a dozen live recordings in the last 50 years. And I'm talking here about live concerts as opposed to live recording in the studio. I did quite a few direct-to-disc records in the 70s and 80s, where we would record one whole side of an LP album in one sitting. I suppose we could do an expose on that sometime because those are some of my favorite recordings, best times in the studio for me. Tremendous amount of pressure, but I think the results were worth it. But there's definitely some differences between recording in a studio and recording a live concert. Whereas the studio is a controlled environment, live venues have all different kinds of acoustical properties, some better than others, obviously. In recording in the studio, you run the song down a few times so the engineer can start to get sounds and figure out how things are going to go, make some changes, dial in some effects maybe. And then you start making takes where the engineer can continue to do that. But with a live concert, you might get a sound check, and it won't be for the whole show. You might get a sound check of a few tunes, and that's primarily for the front of house mixer, for him to make sure he's dialed in for the audience. But when they get around to the performance a couple of hours later, the band might not sound anything like it did at the sound check. The first couple of numbers on a live recording can be a real shocker for the engineer because usually the band will be more intense and louder because now, whereas before they were in an empty auditorium, now there's a gang of people all applauding, and so the adrenaline starts going, and there you go.
So clearly this is a very different environment to what most engineers like Bill are used to. So what are some of the problems that both artists and engineers first need to look out for?
The artist in a live concert knows that now is the time to do it. There's no do-over. So they tend to be putting out their very, very best. In the studio, sometimes the producer, I know I've had to, will have to work with the artist to get them to come up because the atmosphere of a studio is kind of dull and drab, however nice the room itself is. But you need to get the artist to perform. Part of the controlled environment of a studio allows the engineer to control the leakage. That's the sound of one instrument in another instrument's microphone. The stage for a live performer, however, doesn't have that kind of control, especially when they have wedge monitors for their own monitoring. Those monitors will have a mix that they like, and that'll carry into the different people's each musician's microphone. So it can really affect the quality of the sound. About 30 years ago, I would say, I was asked to do a live video that was for a DVD with Randy Travis. And that was the first time the whole band was using in-ear monitors. And when I got around to mixing it, boy, what a difference that makes. It was definitely much more like the sound of a recording studio. So that has really helped now in recent years.
Given that this can be such a stressful and unpredictable environment, there must be so much to learn, especially from those early experiences. So I asked Bill about his first time engineering a live recording.
The first one I did was Barbra Streisand live at the Forum. This was in 1972. I had just done her album, Barbra Jones Streisand, with the great producer Richard Perry. And Clive Davis wanted her to do this live recording, which was a concert for the George McGovern political run that he made and lost. I was very insecure. I'd only been in the business about 3 years and certainly never done anything live. So I was very insecure, but Richard just pushed and pushed and said that he knew I could do it. He knew I could do it. And I certainly didn't know I could. But I finally agreed to do it. When you do a live concert, the stage is the studio, but you need a control room. And that's a recording truck, basically a control room on wheels. And that's a very important part of a live recording. The truck itself, their equipment, and especially their crew, as I came to find out over the years. I believe that first one was the record plant, LA record plant truck in 1972. And I was pretty nervous, but I have to say that Barbra was maybe more nervous than me at that point. She wasn't happy with live concerts at that point and actually remained that way for quite a while. She finally got much better, much calmer, I guess, in doing them because I know about 20 years later, sometime I think in the 90s, I mixed a live concert she did in Las Vegas for a DVD, and she seemed very at ease and everything was really great. But for this McGovern one in 72, she was quite definitely nervous, and it was obvious. She ended up pulling everything off beautifully on stage with a little bit of help, because she did write some lyrics on the stage in case she forgot them. She could look down and read them. But it came off really great. And in fact, there was a single from that, the medley of Sweet Inspiration and Where You Lead, which was the biggest single from the album. I don't think it was huge, but did okay. The interesting thing about that one was it was nominated for a Grammy of the Best Vocal Performance, and it lost to Helen Reddy, I Am Woman. And I guess there's many things I could say about that, but maybe we'll just move on.
Whereas a studio recording tends to be a lot more of a controlled environment, with live recording, you never know how things are going to turn out, especially further on down the road. I'll let Bill explain this one.
A couple of years later, the next one I did live was Marvin Gaye live. And by that point, I had mixed a few records for Motown and was quite unhappy with the fact that they didn't give me credit. The album would say engineer, and it listed the Motown engineer, and then special thanks, Bill Schnee. And my early mentor, Richie Podler, great producer and engineer, had told me in my learning sessions that the credits that you get for working on an album are more important than the money you make. The money you make, you're going to spend and it'll be all gone. The credit that you get will last forever, and it'll also help you get your next job. So I wasn't too happy about not getting credit on it, but I didn't know where to go. Well, lo and behold, Suzanne DePass, who basically ran Motown on the West Coast for Berry Gordy, called me in for a meeting. And she said that she wanted to they were going to do an album out of a concert that Marvin Gaye was going to do in Oakland. Marvin hadn't sung in a few years. He had a singing partner that those fans of his will remember, Tammy Terrell, that he toured with and whatnot, who had very unfortunate health issues at one point. In fact, she fell into his arms on stage and went on, unfortunately, to die at an early age. And he hadn't performed live, I believe, since then. It's been 4 or 5 years, something like that. But he had just had a big album, and they thought maybe it's time to give it a try. So it was at the Oakland Coliseum, and it was going to be another one shot. That's what Barbara's was. So I termed that one shot, which means it's just one night, and so that's it. You've got one chance to capture it, so don't screw up. And Barbara's had gone okay, so I was a lot calmer about that whole concept of it. But what I told Suzanne in the meeting was, okay, I just have two requests before I sign on to do it. One is that I get credited as the engineer, as in engineered by Bill Schnee. And the second thing is I would like a shot at mixing it. And he doesn't, if Marvin doesn't like to mix and wants to remix it, that's fine. But I at least want a shot. And she said, okay to both. Well, 1 out of 2 isn't bad. I did get the credit of engineer, but I did not get a chance to mix it. Nonetheless, the concert itself was incredible. He had the most kickin' R&B band you could ever ask for, rhythm section, the best of the best back then, and a kickin' horn section, and even a few strings. And I'm pretty sure it was the Wally Hyder truck, which might have been out of San Francisco at that point. I don't know if I remember. But it was all packaged very well with incredible Gene Page, the great Gene Page arranger, his arrangements. And it came off very well, very, very well. I was a lot less nervous, as I said, but when we did the sound check, and I didn't even get Marvin singing in the sound check. Another singer came up to test the vocal and whatnot for the front of house guy, which is what the sound check is really for. When I came out of the truck, I walked out of the truck, there was Marvin standing there. And so I introduced myself to him, and he said, "Do you have any chewing gum?" And I was an avid gum chewer back then. So I said, "Sure." And I handed him a stick of gum, and I said, "Are you nervous?" And he said, "Well, maybe a little." But I have to say that when the show started, you didn't hear or feel an ounce of nerves. And the crowd, there had to be 50, I think that room was somewhere around 15, 16,000 people were going crazy for him. The most interesting part of that album for me is that 21 years later, Motown had been sold. Berry Gordy had sold the company, and they now had a girl that was running what they called the Special Products Division. And she called me up and said, "There's a Marvin Gaye album that I want a new mix on." And I said, "Oh, which one is it?" And she said, "It's Marvin Gaye Live." And I said, "You got to be kidding me. I engineered that." And she said, "I know." And to this day, I'm mad at myself that I didn't ask her, why in the world do you want to remix that? It was a very successful record. And I'd never heard of that before or since, of a successful record a couple of decades later being remixed in the same format as in stereo, being done at all. I don't get it, but I was very happy to do it. I'll tell you that. So the tapes came over, and, it was interesting to open up the tape box and see my handwriting, which of course hadn't changed in 20 years. Here, another 30 years later, it's definitely gotten worse, only because you don't use handwriting as much now that we live on keyboards. But my handwriting hadn't changed, and that was fun to see. But what else doesn't change is your sense of humor. And when I made the track sheet at the session, at the gig, when it came to the strings, I had an asterisk. And at the bottom of the page for the key to the asterisk, I just put "good luck," because recording a string section when you've got a kicking rhythm section and horns with strings, a few microphones on strings, you didn't stand a chance of getting much of a string sound. But anyway, I did the best I could with it, and unfortunately, very sadly to me, Marvin never got to hear my mix. He was already gone by then. But I I thought my mix was a little better. The next album was actually a very fun one for me. It was with Olivia Newton-John, and that was 75 or 76, I can't remember. I had just mixed an album for Olivia and her great producer, John Ferrer, the album called Don't Stop Believing. I think that was it. Don't Stop Believing. And I had a great time working with both of them. And so John, the producer, called me and said that we're going to be doing a live album with Olivia in Japan, and we'd like you to come and record it. Now, of course, this made me very nervous because, this was going to be a tour, which meant the good news is it's not a one-shot. You're going to get quite a few options, quite a few chances to get good performances. And of course, I was kind of nervous about having a truck in Japan with a crew that I hope they speak good English, because when you need something from the crew, you need it quickly. That's for sure. It was going to be 3 weeks throughout the whole country of Japan. And it was very fun because at that point, she was a huge star in Japan. How huge? She had 3 of the top 5 singles in Japan at that time. That's when they would play outsiders music a lot more than they began doing in the years to come. But so every time I recorded, it was in a different venue. I don't think we stayed in the same venue ever twice. It was just on to the next. We didn't record every single one because some of them we traveled by plane or even sometimes by train. But the truck couldn't get there quick enough, so there were some that didn't get recorded. But the great thing about that for me was her manager came to me and said, on these ones where we're not recording, would you want to mix the front of house? And I'd never done that in my life, and I thought, yeah, let me give it a whack. And so I'll never forget the first rundown. A sound check, as it were, when I pulled up those drum tracks and felt the power of those drums, like the biggest stereo system ever. It was a lot of fun. And fortunately, I had done enough of the gigs then that I knew what everybody was doing. So mixing it was very easy for me. So that turned out to be a lot of fun. What I learned right away, which is only obvious, seems obvious now, was that every hall every venue made the recording sound differently because of the sound of the room, because the sound of the room will definitely affect what you're what you're getting on tape at that time. Years later, I mixed an album for Herb Alpert and his wife Lonnie Hall, and Herb hadn't been playing out live for quite a while. And he put some guys that are my friends together and just started jamming at his house. And then Lonnie came in and started singing, and they started working up tunes and whatnot, and they thought it might be fun to do a tour. So they put together the first tour and went out on the road, and his front of house guy recorded every gig. And then they decided that maybe they should make a record out of it. And right before that, he asked if he could come into my studio and record a couple of songs. And so we did that. And now that he asked me to mix it as an album, I had almost all but 2 songs were recorded completely live in jazz clubs, and now 2 of them were recorded in my studio. So I worked really hard to try to make the album have continuity, which was one thing with the different halls. That wasn't anywhere near as hard as now they're completely live recording, but in my studio. And as I alluded to earlier, the sound making a big difference in my studio was a much tighter sound than any of the halls. But I did, I think, an okay job. Anyway, the Olivia's album, I don't know what the reason was, but it didn't get mixed for years. And in fact, it finally came out, but only in Japan. And by then, everything that was, she had already, she went on to have her film career and everything that happened with those kind of singles. So it didn't make sense anymore in America, but she still had obviously so many fans in Japan that I guess it made sense for there.
We've spoken already about how unpredictable things can be, and most of the time, despite the nerves, things turn out okay. But sometimes, things don't always go to plan.
The next one was another one-shot. This was with Neil Diamond, who I had done quite a few records with at that. No, let me think about that. No, I did quite a few records with Neil, but at that time, I might have only done one or two at the most. Neil did an album, a really good live album, when you talk about live albums, called Hot August Night in the early 70s with my friend Armin Steiner, great engineer Armin Steiner, which was a terrific sounding album and it was a huge hit. I'm pretty sure that went platinum. But I had worked with Neil, with Bob Gaudio, the great singer, songwriter, and producer of the Four Seasons, co-producer, co-writer, I should say, I guess. He said that Neil was doing an album. It was a tour. I think they were on tour in Europe, maybe England only, but in Europe somewhere. And they were going to conclude with a one-shot at one of the abbeys outside of London. It was Woburn Abbey. And these abbeys are owned by English aristocracy. This particular one was something like 400 years old, and gorgeous mansions on huge plots of land. And a lot of those abbeys had trouble as times had changed with the amount of upkeep that it took. They couldn't afford to do all the upkeep that was necessary. And so this was a chance to make some money for the Abbey to help them. So that's what was done. And the Abbey was absolutely gorgeous. The Lord of the manor took us around and gave us a tour with, which you can imagine was filled with incredible antiques and so on and so forth. And it was out on the front lawn of the Abbey, and it was festival seating. And they had gates around the whole place. And I was out on the front. I had gotten my sound check, and this was a huge show. I think it was 30 songs Neil was doing. And I did get a pretty reasonable sound check. I'll come back to that part in a minute. But I would happen to be standing out, getting ready for things to get going after the sound check with the Lord of the Manor. And way off in the distance, you could see all the people backed up outside the chain link fence. And I'll never forget, all of a sudden, I wish I was on film. You can imagine there's this little, small kind of black dots, and they just kept expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding. And it just started filling up with these people running to get to the front to get a great seat. And you needed a great seat because there were 55,000 people on the front lawn of his Abbey to hear this concert. As I mentioned earlier, the recording truck is an integral part of a live recording. Being in England, I had called my friend Glenn Johns and said, Glenn, I need a recording truck for a date, and so-and-so. And he said, well, the best truck I've used is the Rolling Stones Mobile. So that's who I hired. That's who we got. And I reported back to Glenn afterwards that it must not have gotten used a lot or something, because it was full of problems. For one thing, the air conditioning barely worked, and let's just say it didn't work. And by the end of that 30-song set, sweat was just rolling off my brow. The other thing was that there were all kinds of you couldn't touch anything because something would click or pop or something, and then there were some dropouts, and wouldn't you know, Neil's mic was one of them, and excuse me, and the other interesting part about that particular one that never happened before, obviously they'd all been in front of crowds, 15 to 18,000 people, whatever. But with 55,000 people, we should have parked the truck farther away. The noise from the crowd was so loud, I had to monitor a lot louder than I normally monitor in the truck, to turn the speakers up louder than I normally do to get over the din of those 55,000 screaming people. But I guess, unfortunately, with the dropouts and so on, the album was never mixed. A few cuts somebody mixed and have been on compilation albums, but as an overall album, it never happened.
You got to me, you got to my soul. You got to me, you got control.
Bill's job, of course, is to make these artists and concerts sound as good as possible. And even though we're talking about some amazing performances, without the help of Bill and the team backstage, things aren't going to sound that great. But sometimes the magic of a certain performance can be too distracting, even for Bill.
The next one that I'll tell briefly about comes from one of my favorite chapters in my book, and that's with the Jacksons live. After all, I was on the bus with the Jacksons. Wouldn't you want to read that? So seriously, Freddie DeMann was managing the group back then, and he called me and said that the Jacksons are going on tour in a few months, and we want to make a live album. So I said, oh, great, I would love to do it. And we talked about how many gigs to do, and I suggested doing it in the middle of the tour for two reasons. One, they will be as well rehearsed as they're going to be, and yet not at the end of the tour where they're starting to get worn out. It was a pretty long tour, over 3 months, I think. And as it happened, in the middle of the tour, they were in the Northeast, which made it very, very easy for the recording truck to get around from one gig to the next. Whereas in other parts of the country, sometimes they might fly to the gig, but the truck obviously couldn't get there in time. So that worked out the best. On this project, I got to work with Dave Hewitt, the greatest live sound guy that ever lived, I think. At that time, he was with the New York record plant, and so we had their truck. One of the things that you deal with in a live recording is sharing microphones with the front of house mixer. The truck has to have very high quality splitters to do that, so that the sound that comes in the truck is really, really good. And sharing microphones isn't always the way you want to go. Sometimes I might want or the engineer might want a different microphone than the front of house guy. So you have to try to talk with them and see if he'll change microphones. And if the engineer feels strongly and neither one wants to budge, you might have to run a separate microphone for different instruments. That works for everything but the vocal. The vocal you guys are going to agree on no matter what, obviously. Because what works for the front of house might not work as good, or I might just have an engineer might just have a different choice for that kind of thing. You always try to work with the front of house guy. He is your friend. You don't want to make an enemy out of him. And I have to say, I found David to be sublime at working with people in the house to get what we wanted. So that was an amazing thing. I'll never forget the first couple of nights in the truck. Unfortunately, they didn't film that concert. They didn't think of it then. But there was a camera from the record plant truck on stage so that I could look at what was going on. I could see what was going on. And the first couple of shows, I would be sitting there mixing, and I'd just start watching that camera on Michael and listening, and I'd completely forget what I was there to do, just completely memorized by this guy that was dancing like a maniac and giving near perfect vocals. Just an amazing performer that guy was. So when we finished the last gig, Freddie, the manager, asked me to get a studio in the next town that made sense, where the tour went, which happened to be Nashville. So it was pretty easy to get what he wanted, which was a studio to start going over the takes, to pick things. So I went in the studio, got a mix up on the first reel of the first gig. And when Michael got there, I put him in my chair and hit play, and the thing started, and he said, turn my vocal off, turn my vocal off. I stopped the tape and I said, Michael, you really should listen to your vocals. I mean, they're really gorgeous and near perfect. And he said, no, I want to make everything perfect. And I really didn't agree with that at all, because most people can't get it up the same way to give a performance when you're in that, as I mentioned earlier, as in a control room. But I have to say, he recorded all his vocals over, and when I mixed them, they were every bit as good as the live one. Just absolutely incredible. They had all the same energy. Again, he was quite the performer. In the middle 80s, I did quite a few albums with the great jazz producer Tommy LaPuma. And I had just done the Tutu album that I believe he co-produced with Marcus Miller, incredible bass player. And I had the Tutu album, which was an unusual Miles Davis album, to say the least. And Tommy called a little while after that and said that Miles was going to do the European jazz festivals, and they wanted to make an album. So would like me to go with him and record several of the gigs. Most of them on that tour, most of the time on that tour, he had Robin Ford, fabulous guitar player, playing with him. And again, this was like the Jacksons or Olivia. This was a different place every night. Most of them, they were all outside, I believe, except one. They were all outside. But, there wasn't much to say about that one, other than the fact that the truck was quite good and the crew was good. And in spite of dealing with some of Miles's idiosyncrasies, the recordings, the performances evidently weren't that great, because Tommy never found it necessary to mix it, and as a result, it was never released. Then there's one that it'd probably be one of my favorite live recordings. It's just one of those situations where everything just worked. Everything just fell into place. It was after the Unforgettable album by Natalie Cole, which I didn't work on it, but a lot of it was done in my recording studio, and obviously became a big hit. And she was doing a PBS special. So it was definitely a one-shot. It was at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, which turned out to be a good-sounding hall, and shot for sure with film. So you have to deal with both the front of house guy and now the film people. And it started off a little nerve-wracking, because her crew was all fidgety and weird. There was a lot of agita over somebody getting fired, and right before the gig, literally an hour before I showed up, and it turned out to be the monitor mixer for the monitors. And but fortunately that didn't cause any problems for us. This was one, however, where the front of house guy and I couldn't agree on microphones. So we actually did run separate lines for me on a few instruments. Most of them were fine, but I had to change a few instruments, mostly on the drums. We did have one small problem in the beginning that she had worked out. They had a video of her father singing the song, and they had put it together so that she literally sang Unforgettable with her father, just like the hit record from that album. And we had trouble getting Dad's line from the video, which had it onto the truck so that I could have it. And I was not looking forward to trying to sync that up later. But we got it together. It wasn't bad. Just from the sound check, I knew right away, oh my gosh, this is going to be great, because it sounded great from Jump Street. And why shouldn't it? We had an outstanding orchestra, a great sounding hall, incredible singer with gorgeous songs. As I said, that makes everything easy. And easy it was. I got the film in my studio when they did their edit, and I mixed it to the film, and it came out, and I guess it was a very successful PBS special, as PBS specials goes, because they asked her back to do another one, which I did a couple of years later, a Christmas one. And maybe even more impressive, for me at least, is that it won the Emmy for Outstanding Sound in a musical or variety series. So that was kind of nice, getting that great big gorgeous statue that it is, as opposed to the Grammys, which have always been a little on the wimpy side.
That's why, darling, it's incredible.
With all the difficulties and problems that can occur with a live performance, it's easy to see why this can be a nerve-wracking process. But of course, the upside to this unpredictability is that sometimes something truly magical can happen. Something that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up.
Without question, there is one live recording I did that's more successful than, gracious, maybe all the rest put together in terms of numbers. That would be I Will Always Love You by Whitney Houston. She had just done The Bodyguard, and I'm sure everyone has seen the movie. In the movie, she's of all things a music star, and in the movie she's singing in front of thousands of people. But what the music really is are records that David Foster and a couple of others made, and she's just lip syncing the vocal. Well, she knew that when she found out what the last song was to be, I Will Always Love You, it's a ballad. And she told David, I don't want to try to lip sync a ballad when there's a camera right in my face. So I want to do the vocal live. So David called me and said, get a truck and meet me at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, which is where they were filming the movie at that point. And so there I went, and it was wild, because I was it was just one of those big multi-purpose rooms that big hotels have. And they had built a stage for the musicians and for her. And of course, in the movie, it looks like she's singing in front of thousands of people. But in fact, it was just a crew of about 30 or 40 people when she did it. And what I did, one of my mentors when I recorded Streisand live had told me, you know what you should do. And again, going back to that first live album, I had only been in the business a few years, 3 years maybe. He said, you know what you should do? She's so dynamic. You should record her on 2 tracks, one 10 dB down, so that if she screeches, which she's liable to do, and in fact did, often does, and in fact did, you won't get in trouble. So that's what I did on the Streisand album. Well, I did a very similar thing on I Will Always Love You. I had the microphone into 2 modules, 2 preamps, one of them set down about 8 dB and whatnot, so that same kind of thing. If she drove the limiter out of its mind, I had a limiter for those techies called a compeller. That's a very forgiving kind of limiter when it gets hit hard. But not knowing what I was going to get, and there was no sound check. I mean, there was a sound check with the band, but the first time I heard her voice, they were filming. And the most interesting thing was, at that point in her career, she had literally sung at outdoor festivals in front of 50, 60, maybe more, 1,000 people. But we started off, and here, with an audience, if you will, of 30 to 40 people, she was very obviously nervous. And as you may remember, the first whole verse of this song is a cappella. So that's not a good time to be nervous, because there's nothing to hide the said nerves behind. So the first couple of takes were a little rough. They weren't usable, plain and simple. And I think we took a break after 2 and for her to shake it off. And she came back on take 3, was definitely better, but it wasn't what it could be. And here's where my memory lapses. I don't know how many more there were, but I'm going to just say that the next take 4 was astounding. And right before take 4, actually, Kevin Costner, the co-star, and whose idea it was to do I Will Always Love You as the last song, had come into the truck. And I said something to him about, it's kind of odd that she's so nervous. And he said, yeah, but she's going to nail it. And boy, did she ever. When she hit that last "and I" that we all know so well, mine was not the only neck whose hair was standing straight up, I'm sure. It was just magic, if there's ever musical magic. And it was a phenomenal take, and all of us went crazy applauding at the end of it. You could see her face, that she knew she'd gotten it. And then, of course, we all know how Hollywood works. The director said, "That was amazing, Whitney. Can we do one more for protection?" So what can I say? But there you go.
Thank you so much to Bill for taking the time to speak with me today. If you'd like to learn more about his life and so many more records that he's worked on, you can check out his book, Chairman at the Board. I'll put a link in the description.